Welcome to Live.Work.Thrive. I'm Mikaela Birmingham, Scary Mommy Executive Producer, and I will be the moderator for tonight's panel on understanding microaggressions and how to do better. Some compare microaggressions to 1,000 paper cuts. They are often subtle and yet intentional or unintentional remarks or behaviors that amount to everyday instances of racism, homophobia, sexism, and more. In this expert panel, Live.Work.Thrive will discuss how all members of a family can be more aware of microaggressions, how to stop them, and how to respond when one happens. Specifically, tonight's panel will discuss understanding our unconscious bias and blind spots, how to respond with grace if you make a microaggression, how to be an ally if you observe a microaggression, and tools and language for both children and adults. Let's meet our panelists. Tonight we have with us Dr. Dolly Chugh, an award-winning social psychologist and professor at the New York University Stern School of Business. She is the author of the book, The Person You Mean to Be: How Good People Fight Bias. Dolly's TED Talk was named one of the 25 most popular of 2018, and she publishes a free newsletter called Dear Good People. Dolly has an undergraduate degree in psychology and economics from Cornell University and received her MBA and PhD from Harvard University. Thank you for being with us tonight, Dolly.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Also with us is Cheyenne E. Batista. Cheyenne is founder and CEO of Firefly Worldwide, Inc., a global education consulting practice that supports leaders with strategy and equity-driven practices. She has a BA in Communication Studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an EDM in Education Policy and Management from Harvard Graduate School of Education. Cheyenne was featured on a TED Masterclass as a keynote and is an internationally recognized speaker. Cheyenne, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Later on in the show, we will also hear from Rosetta Lee. Since 2004, Rosetta has been a diversity speaker and trainer on topics including cross-cultural communication, implicit and unconscious bias, and bullying in schools. She is a faculty member and outreach specialist at the Seattle Girls School. So before we get started, I have a few quick reminders for everyone out there watching. You can submit your questions in the comments wherever you are seeing the show, and we may feature your question later on. Join our mailing list so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming virtual events. Visit scarymommy.com/liveworkthrive to sign up and stay in touch. You can also now leave us a voicemail. Yes, very old school, but the hotline is very hot right now, so give us a call. Tell us what you're struggling with or what topics you'd like to see on the show. Here's the number, 1-800-422-3910. And hot off the press, we have a dedicated Instagram account, so you can stay in the know and be the first to find out all the hot tea. Follow Live.Work.Thrive on IG. Okay, let's get into tonight's topic. So let's level set for everyone out there. Dolly, I'll start with you. Can you tell us what is unconscious bias and why is it hard for us to recognize it in ourselves?
Absolutely. Unconscious bias, there's a lot of parallels between unconscious bias and unconscious other things. So, Mikaela, maybe I could just do a quick little, we didn't plan this, let's just try it. I'm going to say a word and you just tell me what comes to your mind when I say it.
Okay, okay, let's
Ready?
do it, Dolly.
Let's
You're
do
just
it.
making me nervous, but okay.
We can do this. Peanut butter.
My dog loves it.
Exactly. So there was a very quick association that immediately came to your mind. Other people might have said jelly or sandwich or allergy. There might be a whole variety of things that come to mind when I say peanut butter. And there's an association that's formed that within milliseconds between peanut butter and that thing. What unconscious bias is other associations we have that have to do with categories of people. And so the unconscious biases that we're most likely to be talking about in a conversation like this one might be unconscious biases we have about Black people, about women, about gay people, or any other group. And the point of interest for most of us, including me, as I wrestle with my own conscious biases, which are sometimes difficult to admit, is when that unconscious bias is not lined up with how I think consciously. Most of our mind's work takes place outside of our consciousness. Some studies say as much as upwards of 99% of our mind's work is not something we're consciously aware of. So when I'm unconsciously associating, for example, Black people and danger, just the way you associated peanut butter in your dog, or someone might associate peanut butter and jelly. That unconscious bias is not consistent with my conscious belief about Black people. That's often difficult for us to admit. I know when I have unconscious biases revealed to me, I get defensive about it. It's not the person I mean to be.
Okay, so that is a good way of looking at it. Now, Cheyenne, can you help us think about why our own blind spots are an opportunity for influencing change? How can we kind of look at, our own sort of biases and think about those as a starting point for a conversation?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Our biases are obviously rooted, they come from somewhere. And one of the most challenging aspects of confronting our biases are they are at the end of the day manifestations of racism, sexism, and despite our best intentions, it can be difficult to sort of register that something I just said, a thought that just quickly came to my mind, regardless of my intentions, can be really harmful. So it's really important. It can be really important to first contend with this manifestation is an ism, despite my best intentions, before then going forward to doing the work of change. It's important to change because these issues cause harm. They cause what is now generations of harm to minoritized communities, to communities who are not of dominant groups, be they around race, gender identity. The term, my offering is also in the smallest of moments of the best intentions, including a term like blind spots, which some might push and say, or do push and say, the term blind spots itself can be an opportunity to take a look at our own language and framing because of some inherent ableism that might be there when we think about folks who live with blind spots in actuality and might find there be some misrepresentation of what it might be like to live with blind spots. So there's almost an opportunity within the question to answer the question of, we all have opportunities to become familiar with the harms that microaggressions cause through our everyday language that has become the norm, often uninterrogated. And by interrogating the language and really listening to the perspective of those who tend to be most marginalized and don't often or consistently get the microphone to speak, there might inherently be some opportunity to revisit. So there's an opportunity for all of us to really examine the language and the framing around these biases so that we can go forth and do better and discontinue the harm that's been caused to communities of all kinds.
Thank you for pointing that out. That is something that had not occurred to me, that even just the phrase is inherently, a privileged piece of language, used by people with full vision ability, right? So let's talk a little bit about privilege. Dolly, how does privilege play a role in the formation of bias?
Well, let's unpack what we mean by privilege. There's a wonderful metaphor that I like to borrow from writer Debbie Irving, where she talks about headwinds and tailwinds. And the way to think about this is, let's say you're like, all right, I'm going to go for a run or a walk or a bike ride, something outdoors. And you get out there and you're like, I got this. I'm power walking. I got this. And I'm going to, your goal is I'm going to go to the fire hydrant and then U-turn back home. And after you make that U-turn, you suddenly realize you're having to work a lot harder to go the same distance. You're sort of losing some motivation because your effort is not converting into results. And if somebody were watching from a window in a nearby building and saw you, they might even think you're not trying, that there's no effort here. Of course, what they aren't able to see through the window is that I'm now running into a headwind that I can feel that is affecting my performance. Through the window, they may not, that headwind may not be visible to them. And by the way, when I was on my way to the fire hydrant, I had a tailwind at my back and I didn't feel it. I thought it was, the carbs I wasn't eating was sort of generating my briskness, when in fact it was the tailwind that I couldn't feel. Privilege is that tailwind. And the thing that makes it tricky is that we don't feel it. And the same thing often happens with privilege. And moments when we think that what we're doing is completely attributable to our own efforts, there may in fact be tailwinds that are supporting us.
I love that analogy, Dolly. So good. And it's bringing me back to mile 25 of the New York City Marathon
Yeah.
when I had no tailwinds ever and probably fewer toenails than I had at the beginning of that race. But that is such a good analogy. Okay, so let's get into the meat here of defining a microaggression. Cheyenne, can you just, take us through exactly what that is? Because I feel like the lines can get blurred a little, and I just want to kind of articulate so everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, thank you. It's an opportunity again with language, right? Because the prefix micro automatically yields thoughts about something small. And whereas microaggressions are small in a sense, small in intention, it can be a slight. So let me back up. The definition of a microaggression is a slight insult, a slight invalidation. It can be words, derogatory slurs, a comment, an assumption that is reflective of, again, derivative of racism, sexism, ableism, and is a slight towards a particular group that is not of the dominant group, depending on what the particular comment being made is. The word microaggression, again, implies something small, but just like 1,000 paper cuts over time, the scars build, it builds on, one scar builds on top of the other, and it becomes often a lifetime of trauma that, again, depending on your identity, whether you are situated within multiple minoritized identities or non-dominant identities, it can often be the life experience to have these microaggressions coming your way time and time again, that they're no longer, nor have they ever been, small in nature.
Okay. And so, sometimes when we talk about this, even to be totally transparent, even in the promotion for tonight's talk, we had some pushback from people out there who were saying, everybody's taking everything too seriously. You can't even make a joke anymore. Nobody can say anything. Dolly, why is it important to recognize that a joke can be a microaggression, even if it was intended to be funny?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the question is always whose expense is the joke at, right? Who's laughing and who's being laughed at is, I think, the distinction we want to look for. I also want to just out myself a little bit here. I relate to that feeling that sounds like some of the pushback you described of gosh, is there nothing I can say? Is nothing okay anymore? I kind of relate to that, but when I reflect on where it's coming from this place of me clinging to an identity I care about and that research says many of us care about, which is me feeling like a good person. And that when I'm told, oh, that words you use, the language you're using is doing some harm, the joke you're telling is problematic, what I'm hearing is I'm not a good person. And if we care about that identity, and if we view it as an either I am or I'm not, it's like a brittle identity, we are always going to defend our good person identity. And when we do that, that means we say, what's wrong with them saying the joke, the language, the slight, the microaggression is a problem. We're going to externalize the problem. And so I'm on this mission to get us to stop trying to be good people and try to be what I call goodish people, which I believe to be a higher standard than good. Good is either or, it's brittle. Goodish is I am a work in progress. It builds off of the research of Carol Dweck, psychologist at Stanford, who talks about when we believe ourselves to be work in progress, we actually make more progress. And I think that would help us a lot when we're having that feeling of why is everything a problem now?
I like that way of looking at it. And Cheyenne, I've heard this comparison of, in thinking about racism, that racism is not like getting your tonsils out, where you're either racist or you're not racist. It's more like doing the work of being anti-racist is like flossing. You have to do it a little bit every day. You keep it up, and once in a while you might get a piece of salad stuck in your teeth, and your friend's going to point it out, and you've got to deal with it. Is that fair to say from the way you see things in your research?
It's certainly an ongoing work. It is certainly work that should be, the word that's coming to mind is multitudinous. It should be coming from multiple angles. It should be who is informing your thinking. You should constantly be thinking about who informs my thinking. Why do I think the way that I do? And if the sole source is, my parents as an example, and what they told me at the dinner table growing up, or my influential aunt or grandmother, and I haven't diversified the ways in which I think and the people that inform my thinking, then I might find myself stuck. So to your point about, is it, that floss, it is constant. It's a muscle that you are working out. And frankly, you can work out that muscle and get really buff and ready for your world championship, but you put the weight down and that awareness goes away, and the ability to recognize these issues in the moment, the ability to speak to them, the ability to have the words. So often folks say, I just didn't know what to say, or I didn't know how to either call it out, or I was frozen in the moment, much like the moments that Dolly is describing, where someone might say something and I freeze up because I'm looking in the mirror thinking I'm a good person, but that goodness has just been, a spotlight has been shone on it, so for me to take another look. So yes, it's ongoing work, and the minute you put that weight down or the floss down, you might have some plaque buildup that's not so welcoming.
So the response of, oh, but I didn't mean it that way, I'm not a racist, is, in line with Dolly's, theory of, I want to be a good person. I want you to know that I'm a good person. But what we're saying here is that it's not an either or. It's a process, and it's not like a light switch. Okay, so one of the common microaggressions that I myself have heard, I always like to say it's my party trick if I go somewhere and people are like, where are you from? Nobody will ever figure it out in a million years, so don't even bother asking. But where are you from? Where are you really from? It can go on and on and on. And so I want to go now to a clip from Rosetta Lee, who's a diversity speaker and trainer, who will tell us how she responds to the question, where are you really from? Here she is.
And it's the same way I ask people to be thoughtful when people are like, where are you from? And I'm like, well, I'm from Seattle, Washington. And they're like, where are you really from? And I'm like, I was raised in Massachusetts. And they're like, where are you really from? And I'm like, I was born in South Korea. Ultimately, I think the where are you from question happens to a subset of the community, right? And often there is this like expected answer. Folks were actually waiting for me to name another country, which is part of the stereotype around Asians being perpetual foreigners, right? And so my thing is, if you find yourself in a situation where you're asking or doing something that you wouldn't do for anyone else, maybe we can pause and be thoughtful about where does that come from? And if we can't put our finger on it, or there are some discrepancies, then maybe we pause from that behavior.
So Dolly, you talk a lot about this, instant sort of, scientifically proven that we just kind of go into this innate response of defensiveness when we're put in a moment that questions our, let's call it goodness. How do we train ourselves not to go into that red zone of shame and defensiveness, but instead respond more gracefully in a sort of growth mindset to a conversation like this? Can you give us maybe some sample language in terms of how to, take in that information without shutting down?
Absolutely. There's a bunch of tips that I've had a lot of practice with this, not only as a researcher, but as a human being grappling with my own defensive responses. I'm a professor, as you mentioned. A student might say that I've used a word in class that they thought was inappropriate, or I've assigned a reading that they found to be sexist. And in those moments, I really want to say, how dare you? What I have to remind myself, the first thing I have to remind myself of is what Michael Bungay-Stanier calls the WAIT rule, spelled capital WAIT. Why am I talking? The WAIT rule. I loved what Cheyenne said a moment ago. She said, who is informing my thinking? in those moments, why am I talking when someone's giving me the gift to inform my thinking? So that's the first tip. The second tip is to use the word yet. I don't understand what you're telling me. I don't understand why you're upset. I don't understand what was wrong with what I said, ... yet. That's the growth piece. That's the work in progress piece. So why am I talking? Meaning listen, yet as a key word in this scenario. And finally, to take the approach we take in so many other domains of our life, and everyone listening can think about which domain this is for you, but what's the domain where you think, gosh, I am so much better, more skilled, more fluent in X today than I was last month or last year or 5 years ago. My running time is faster. My abilities on Wordle are better. My whatever it is, what is something that even in these difficult days we have improved at? That's a good reminder of what we're trying to do in these kinds of conversations. We want to have that same mindset that we brought to getting better at something where we were, looking for opportunities to improve as opposed to looking for opportunities to defend.
Michaela, may I throw something in there?
Sure. Yes, please do.
This is overlapping so much. We didn't mention earlier, but I'm in the final weeks of my dissertation writing. Please send me luck, by the way. Also, all the listeners, please send me some good vibes and positivity vibes. I mention it because part of what I'm looking at is how conflict surfaces among interracial teams. And a lot of what you see in conflict is parallel to the moments of a microaggression, because you folks, when you're called in or called out, whatever the phrase you choose to use, if you're called in and someone says, hey, you just committed this microaggression, you can find yourself in fight or flight mode where your brain goes haywire for a bit, your rational thinking goes haywire for a bit, and you're not in a place to really hear what the other person's saying because you immediately go into this defense mode that Dolly's talking about. I mention it because so often in conflict, and often as with microaggressions, it's rare that the offender seeks perspective from the person who's been inflicted. It's rare that the offender feels inclined to say, let me put my own needs aside for a moment and ground this conversation in the perspective of the other person who's been harmed. And so it's just interesting hearing Dolly, as Dolly's talking, just seeing a lot of those parallels, both with conflict and these moments of microaggressions where we instantly go into protection mode because my perception of myself and others' perception of me as a good person becomes compromised in that moment. And so there's all sorts of stuff happening in our brain and our bodies that cause us to react in that way.
Yeah, that's great.
That is so, well, yes, good luck. I'm wishing you good
Much
luck,
needed.
Cheyenne. Goodness. Okay, you need it. It's the home stretch. But your work, I was watching some of your past talks online, and anyone out there who wants to learn more of Cheyenne has some amazing talks up on YouTube. But you mentioned in one of them the manner in which schools can, unfortunately perpetuate inequity by allowing microaggressions to persist in the school environment. And I wanted to touch on this because I think it's really important for parents to be aware of. We don't always see everything that goes on in the school day when we send off our kids, but tell us a little bit about the ways that this can happen in a school environment and what impact does that have on children?
Yeah, I really appreciate us zoning it in on schools because, schools are supposed to be benevolent institutions where parents drop off their cherished little ones and spend most of their waking hours with adults, most of whom haven't been trained in this work, unless schools and their teacher preparation programs, leadership preparation programs have invested here. But students of color, Black, Indigenous, and other students of color, and students who are immigrants can find themselves facing microaggressions up to between 2 to 7 times more frequently than their white student peers. I'm talking now about racial microaggressions. Teachers, again, in the most passing moment, may make a comment, may ask, really, where are you from? Might say to an Asian student, oh, you must be in the math class down the hall, just connecting stereotypes about certain groups to students, and again, making these comments in passing. And students often aren't equipped with the language to say, hey, that hurt. you hurt me just now. Your comment was offensive, or it's making me question my own belongingness here. And what we also see is the impact of stereotype threat, where when students experience these stereotypes applied to them time and time again, that can impact their perceptions of themselves and their performance. We've seen this in study after study. It can impact performance on exams, student self-perception. And so again, this push on the prefix of microaggressions, and I believe the root of the word microaggressions is a sociological term, and there's some rationale for why it's called micro. But there are a few things that are micro about the impact of the people on the receiving end. And ultimately, microaggressions can lead to mental health challenges, challenges around self-perception, performance, and so forth. And so, yes, this is an issue that takes place very frequently in schools. By the way, not just teacher to student, but student to student, teacher to teacher, leader to teacher. I'm simplifying here, but it's multi-directional. And until we're in a place where entire school communities or organizations become fluent in this language and these issues and really unpacking where they come from, and again, getting honest about the fact that they are manifestations of racism, they're manifestations of sexism. We sometimes soften the language, which can be important to having the conversation, but it's important to get to the root of this is a manifestation of racism, none of which was written into the vision of the school when we designed our school system. That can be argued, but none of the direct intentions. Few people lead schools with the direct intention of perpetuating racism and sexism, yet it's done every day without adequate response or turnaround.
That is so true. And, we asked our audience to write in and to tell us how they help guide their kids around microaggressions. And one of the things that I imagine may happen, we've just heard in the past year or so, multiple situations where schools are banning certain types of Black hairstyles, just something so obvious, so many negative impacts that something like that would have. But even something as simple as hair touching child to child without consent is seen as a microaggression. So we had a comment from one of our audience members, Verlania, who had this to say. Here's her comment. I've unintentionally said offensive things, but once confronted about them, I understood and I appreciated the opportunity to step into someone else's shoes. My daughter is being raised the same way. Small kids may not understand at first because they don't have the life experience, but they can learn to do and to respect others' boundaries. It helps if their parents learn first. So Dolly, what do you think about, the idea of, parents have to kind of become conscious of our own biases before they're able to help guide their kids to think about it in the same way? Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. And I think our kids, as we all have learned one way or another, our kids are watching what we do more than we say. So there's lots of things that we can do in our behavior that are going to create that modeling for our kids. However, there's also great reverse mentoring, as they call it in the business world, that can happen with our kids. I mean, my kids do this to me all the time. I have two teenagers. For example, one of them said the other day, we had this wonderful guest speaker in class. This surgeon was telling us about XYZ surgery. And I was like, wow, what did he say? And my kids were like, Mom, I never said it was a he. Why would you assume that? And so obviously my unconscious bias slipped out there. It was very embarrassing. I wanted to be like, well, you heard me wrong. I totally wanted to cover it up. But in that moment, it's a great opportunity for me to model being goodish to my kids, to model what it's like to learn from others, all the kinds of tools that Cheyenne was describing earlier. So our kids, yes, we have to we have to model for them, but also we have to learn from them.
That makes a lot of sense. So, okay, so let's talk now about when we observe a microaggression happening. We're a bystander in this situation. Why is it important to address it right away in the moment, as opposed to, tap the person on the shoulder and say, hey, can I talk to you after this meeting? Cheyenne, what's the difference between a sort of public, discussion versus a private one?
Yeah, a few things. One, what I appreciate about the question is, first of all, calling the need to addressing it at all, right? Because we, as a society, we still haven't mastered that part. So addressing it at all is key, because again, in the nature of the slight or the micro invalidation or the micro insult, it can kind of go by, it can slip by. And unless we put words to it, it can be difficult to recognize that, whoa, let's pause. This was a moment we should address, and someone was harmed here. So the sheer act of responding to it in and of itself is one that requires a lot of attention. Secondly, it's where do we put the onus on who has the onus of the response, right? And it should typically not be the person who's been harmed, right? And so to your question around why might it be important to respond to these issues when they come up in the moment, is first of all, it can require multiple minds to put to words what just happened, because sometimes it's so slight that you don't realize, whoa, that was offensive. And when and this is the work that I do with schools and in our nonprofit organizations, when you've trained multiple people to recognize it in the moment, you now have multiple folks who are equipped not just with the knowledge, but with the language to say, whoa, take a beat, something was said here or done here, that's not okay. So the importance of responding for in and of itself is a challenge that a lot of organizations face, the knowing how to, but also to your point, the private conversations on the side don't do much for building a culture amongst a group, amongst a team, in a classroom, amongst a group of managers. It doesn't do much to build culture if it's not named in the moment, named well, named with fluency, vocabulary, confidence, and also if the naming is being done not by the person who's just harmed and sitting there going, there's my 999th paper cut, this hurts, and did anyone else around just see what happened?
Right. So I think what you're saying is that, when you have the 999 paper cuts, it's exhausting to be the one over and over and over to be like, here you go again with that comment. And they're like, oh, here she goes again. The complainer over there in the corner, which, you can get put into those buckets if you are constantly the vocal person. So what might a boardroom, classroom, group of friends look like if the recipient of the microaggression could rely on the others in that community to be the champions of, speaking up, to take some of that onus off of, the person who's constantly having to respond. Dolly, can we get there? And does that sort of behavior or culture strengthen the group dynamic?
Absolutely. And we can get there in some ways, maybe more efficiently than we assume. We might assume that we need to get everybody on board to get there. But the reality is the way human behavior is shaped is by other people. We like to think we're individuals and agentic and free thinkers, but the research is so clear that we are shaped by the behavior of the people around us, what we feel the norm is. And so I use this 20-60-20 rule that my former life in consulting we used to use when we were talking to big companies going through big changes. It applies really well in the circumstances we're discussing here. The 20-60-20 rule is, let's say this microaggression has taken place. 20% of people are going to be very open to learning what happened and what they could have done better. They might be embarrassed, they might be mortified, but they're like, give it to me. Like, I'm going to soak it up. Let's call them the open 20. 20% of people, you could spend the rest of the year trying to help them understand, and they're not going to get there on that issue. So call them the closed 20. And then notice there's a middle 60 left. The middle 60 is just not deeply engaged. They're not thinking too hard about this issue. This isn't the hill they're going to die on. They're not going to argue strongly one way or another. They are going to go where the winds blow, the norms. So what we can really do is influence that middle 60. If we can get that open 20 and that middle 60, we go a long way at neutralizing the closed 20. We may not change their minds, but we will probably change their behavior just by changing the norm. Last thought on this, the middle 60 is most persuaded when you're not deeply entrenched on an issue, what persuades you most is stories, humanizing the issue. Talk about your personal experience, talk about your roommate from college, talk about your child, make it real. It's not a statistic, it's not a definition, it's a story. So that's what I would say. We can get there, but rather than trying to throw ourselves at everything all the time, let's be smart. Let's go for the open 20, the middle 60, and let's try to neutralize the harm of the closed 20, but not, it's like that uncle at the holiday meal who you just argue with the whole time. And by the end of the meal, you're both exhausted. Neither of you is your best self anymore. And everyone else has like gone to the kitchen to do the dishes. Spend your time at the sink working on everybody else.
So I like that way of breaking it down. It's very much like a political strategy. I love it. So Cheyenne, how do you she mentions the uncle at the holiday dinner, but as parents, I feel like that sort of family microaggression scenario comes up more often than not with, let's say, a grandparent or an older relative who, you go out for a Chinese dinner and suddenly grandpa's ordering with an accent that, grandpa did not walk in the door with, let's say, thinking it's funny. It's obviously not. It's not appropriate. How do you, consider when your closed 20 is 85 years old and very set in their ways? Is there any advice in approaching that, especially because when you have children around, you want to model as parents, hopefully, being an ally and being, calling out these situations. But it's tricky when you have this generational gap on top of all of the other ideological differences.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I think I might be having a connection issue. So let me know if for any reason you're not hearing me. Okay.
Okay.
What I say is you hit the nail right on the head with the modeling piece. It's so critical for parents, for family members to model what it looks like to address it to begin with. We may not always have the right words. We can even frame the conversation like, Grandpa, you just said something. I don't even have all the best words to address it, but I want to talk about this with you. Can you work this through with me? As approaching the conversation as an invitation in moments where you don't have all the exact words, but you know that an issue should be addressed. Something else that comes to mind is using inquiry. We often underestimate the power of inquiry. And when we don't always have the language and the tools, we can simply ask, well, Grandpa, why are you talking like that? And Grandpa might have some flippant reason. And then we can say, well, Grandpa, but why? Where does that come from? Have you considered how that might land on somebody else? So leaning on inquiry as an approach towards opening the conversation instead of antagonizing Grandpa in a way that's going to lead him to shut down. So we often underestimate the power of questions. And frankly speaking, Grandpa at 85, set in his ways, and the 20% that Dolly describes may or may not be willing to hear it, even with your best your best attempts, your best question asking, your best modeling. And then I think there's an opportunity there for parents, caregivers of any kind, for the children in particular, to have the conversation after the conversation. Debrief what just happened and talk through whether it turned out the way it could have or should have, and ask the child questions about how they perceive the moment, what their feelings are about it, how comfortable they feel in these moments, and what they might take away from the conversation that they witnessed with Grandpa or anyone else in the family. And the last thing I'll say also is modeling the vulnerability. Adults around children being able to say, I goof this up sometimes too. Let me tell you a story about a time that someone had to have that kind of conversation with me. It just models for children the vulnerability, and it says it's okay to group this up in-house. I don't want to say it's okay to group this up externally and keep causing harm. I don't want to make light of that, but there's something to be said about a parent or, again, a caregiver of a child saying, I mess this up too sometimes, and this is how I deal with it. And this is how I'd like you to think about these issues for yourself too.
That is a great tip, with the conversation after the conversation. So after you get home, be like, okay, we just got to break down what went on at the waiter's desk with Grandpa. Got it. Okay. And so, Dolly, help us think a little bit about this idea of, when and who we are ready to sort of invest in these conversations with, because you may be in situations where it's a colleague, it's a longtime friend or a family member where you really want to, have that conversation and hopefully impart a little bit of education, but you may be in a scenario where it's just not appropriate or useful or safe for you to do so. So how do you sort of navigate these situations and make that determination as to whether or not this is a moment to engage or not?
Absolutely. Well, I think the 20-60-20 rule is one good guide in that moment to give us a sense of whether to enter this conversation. I will say that I think we tend to underestimate the influence we have on others. The data suggests that even when we have what feel like confrontational conversations where the response of the other person was defensive, and we walk away from that conversation saying, uh, I wish I hadn't even brought it up. That went terribly. They're never going to change. The data actually says that that conversation had more impact than we thought in the moment. Just because the conversation wasn't pleasant, and I'm not saying that's always unpleasant, but sometimes it is, doesn't mean there isn't going to be a change in behavior. There's a really clever study that was done on Twitter by a political scientist team where they just used bots to respond to tweets using the N-word. And the bot simply said something to the effect of, "Hey man, that's not cool." It was just that simple from some bot-like tweet. And they found that the person using the slur was less likely to use the slur again for the following month, especially if they were an anonymous person using the slur, or in other words, like if their handle didn't reveal who they were. Perhaps the people who were using their own name as their handle, it wasn't an unconscious, if that would ever be unconscious, I wouldn't describe it that way, but it maybe they were less embarrassed by their use of the slur. In other words, we can't underestimate that just having the conversation, just even one word, when you can't find the words as Cheyenne described, sometimes all I say is ouch, or wow, or wow, dear friend of mine, you seem way too young to have such outdated views. Like just a simple phrase that punctures the norm that's being set so it doesn't fall across the crowd as what's okay.
Great. I love those suggestions of language. And on this note of kind of responding, this time let's think about responses in a public situation, maybe with a stranger. I want to return to Rosetta Lee, who has a unique strategy for dealing with microaggressions that used to happen to her pretty frequently. And when she found that staying silent about them started to really bother her, she came up with a creative way to respond. Here she is.
It used to bug me when non-Asian people would be walking down the street and just in passing, and they'd be like, "Konnichiwa, ni hao," and I'm like, seriously? And this is a casual encounter. I'm not going to invest in a whole full-on educational conversation with that person. So it used to bug me because I wouldn't say anything, and I'm like, why does this still keep on happening? So instead of letting that sort of impact accumulate and my bother accumulate, I decided, okay, so what are some things I can do? And so this is actually a really well practiced response, and it's like automatic now. When people are like konnichiwa, I'm like bonjour, and they're like, I'm not French, and I'm like, and I'm not Japanese, have a nice day, right? So for me, I'm no longer triggered by those moments. In fact, I kind of look forward to it because I love watching people's responses when I do that. But it's that idea of, if you know that it has emotional weight for you, again, practice with a friend, practice in front of the mirror. I'm often muttering to myself in the shower, and my spouse is like, who are you talking to? And I'm like, I'm trying to formulate a way that I want to say this that feels good to me. And so again, give yourself permission for having those emotional responses. But if you're not fond of the way the emotions are making you respond in that moment and you want something better, I would invite you to recognize your triggers and practice for responding to them, for strangers, for close and loved ones, whatever the case may be.
So Cheyenne, what do you think of Dolly's suggestion here about sort of thinking about a situation that you know is likely to come up? You know, maybe it's that person at your office who's always got the comments that you're constantly getting more and more frustrated with. Does practicing or sort of going over that language beforehand help when you're in the situation?
For sure. I think for those of us who've been on the receiving end of these harms, that practice in and of itself can call upon us in ways that we may not be ready for. So I always say, first check in with yourself to make sure that this is something that you want and need to do. Because the harm has been caused, you may find healing in addressing it, or you might find deeper harm, right? Like, do you owe this person that type of engagement when they've just harmed you to begin with? And it's why it goes back to, again, what the importance of building a culture where if someone was within earshot, or there's a team culture where, you know, to Dolly's point, simply saying ouch, and you know, we have teams that we work with that's their code word, ouch, so that it causes folks to lean in and let others do the work while the person harmed is tending to their wound. So I first and foremost say tend to your wound first. That's your first and foremost priority before having to then lean in and teach, you know, offer this person a teachable moment. I juggle between the two. There's sometimes where, and I've been on the receiving end of multiple microaggressions. They're sometimes deeply emotionally harmful. Sometimes they're so ridiculous I can chuckle. Other times I have the energy and I can do something about it. I first check in with myself to say, how do you feel? And do you owe this person this moment? Maybe you don't owe it to them, but it can go a long way. So Michaela, to your question, I then lean into this strategy of, okay, what are the words that I can use and I have in my back pocket so that when the shock and I'm stunned and I don't really know what to say, that they're at least ready. But I think it's important to say, do the check-in if you've been on the receiving end, and as we're talking about children, if children have been on the receiving end too, making sure to let them know, check in with yourself first and make sure you're ready for whatever those next steps are. And if not, there are other channels through which to address the ways in which you've been harmed.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to hit you both with a couple questions from our live audience who are watching right now. Let's see. Dolly, let's take this one. What do you do if you're nervous that the questions you're asking to try and learn come off as microaggressions? Like, is asking how to pronounce someone's name a microaggression?
Got it. Yeah. So pronouncing names correctly, I think, is a really easy, accessible step that we can all take. In fact, that's often something I say, that today go learn how to correctly pronounce 3 names that you may not have been saying correctly. You don't necessarily have to ask the other person how to do it. In the age of the internet, I often do this in my teaching. I Google how to pronounce and then the name, and audio files come up that you can listen to. That's, of course, if you have access to that before you meet them or after you meet them. I think it's usually welcome in most cases to ask, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Or can you teach me how to pronounce your name? But to do it in a way where you're listening to the response, because I find myself sometimes so nervous in that moment. They tell me, I don't hear it because I'm so nervous. And then I just continually say it wrong time and time again. But I think in most cases, a name is the first decision that people we love make about us. It's a really important decision, and that us taking care to pronounce it in a way that honors the history and heritage of that name is really important.
I'll just say, as someone with a quote unquote hard to pronounce name that's been wrong forever, my university diploma even was wrong in the spelling. I'm so desensitized at this point that I do definitely appreciate it when someone asks, how do you pronounce your name? Because it's like, oh, you're making an effort, not like the other 99,000 people before you who just wanted to call me Michael. So keep asking. That's my 2 cents. Here's another question from our audience. Cheyenne, how do you respond to, well, I'm offended that you're offended? This is another kind of common response here.
I always fast forward to this example whenever this question comes up, and it's a good one. Imagine I'm in my outfit to go out. We're heading out. I'm in my pointiest stiletto heel, and we're about to have the greatest time ever. And by mistake, now you're my best friend. I love you dearly. by mistake, I step on your toe. I mash your toe with that stiletto heel. You are in throbbing pain. Imagine the absurdity of me standing there going, oh, but it wasn't my intention. I'm a good person. My stilettos are so cute. Like, it's just absurd that I would stand there tending to myself in that moment when someone else is in pain. So what you say to that person, perhaps even offer that, feel free to offer that story. I don't even know if I can claim it as an original. I might have heard it from someone else. I use it often in my trainings. But what you can do is either offer to that person, but it's also just, zooming out and imagining the absurdity of tending to the offender when someone is standing there wounded. So whether that helps your own mindset and psyche as you think about, do I address this in the moment or do I not say anything? Or whether it's how you approach the conversation with the person who's just harmed you, it's something to consider.
My toes are hurting just by thinking about that story. Okay, so Dolly, can you take this one? How do you respond to someone who says, you can't say anything anymore, everyone is trying to cancel everyone, people are too sensitive?
Yeah. That's it to me. I hear good person, fixed mindset in that. That's what I think is being said is this cancel culture is saying there's good people and bad people. So the first thing I would say is, while I'm sure there are some people listening in who have huge followings who would truly be canceled if they said or did certain things, most of us do not have huge followings. Most of us are in smaller spheres, and getting canceled simply means being corrected or being given the gift of feedback. So my response there is take it. It's an opportunity that doesn't come easily. It took courage for someone to quote unquote cancel you. There's also certain things that should be canceled. I think it's good that there's a willingness. Maybe we've got things with the internet to an extreme, and at some point this will normalize in an equilibrium. But we've gone from a place where institutions and people with power could do things without consequence, and now there's consequence.
I can think of a few podcasts that might apply in that scenario. So Cheyenne, here's another one. How do you respond to, do you have to make everything about race? We got this one in our comments on our own page, actually, with just the fact that we were having this talk tonight.
My short answer is yes. I could offer you a whole ton of context on why should it all be about race. Yes, race and racism permeate so much of our daily lives. And if you look at any other form of marginalization, there's a story of racism to be told within each of those manifestations. So, my short answer is yes. I know that can be jarring for some folks to hear. To continue to ignore the stats, the stories, the harm, the implication, the outcomes, both at a systems level, an institutional level, an individual level, they're there. And it's a conversation that is, frankly, we've been talking about outdated language and antiquated thinking. Like, we are in a place in society where we just need folks to understand there is a race implication to just about every facet of society within the United States and globally, frankly. So should everything be about race? My simple answer is yes. More globally, I want to make sure also to not leave this conversation acknowledging that there are many other manifestations of the isms through these microaggressions. There are a number of other groups who are marginalized. Michaela, I offered you that, the nudge on the term blind spots. That was an offering made to me. I was a trainer in a room of 60 people. And one of my participants, this was a couple of years ago, one of my participants said, hey, you're up here talking about equity and you're using this term. And it was an offering. And it is long overdue that each of us takes an opportunity to recognize the areas where we're least familiar and are potentially causing harm, even with our best intentions. And if understanding that the issue of race permeates society in a number of ways is your starting spot, then let's begin, because it's a conversation and a need that's centuries overdue.
I like that. Let's begin, as we are about to wrap up. But I think it is a good way of thinking about it. It's like we have to just start. It's not, it's not ever finished, but we have to begin. So as I said, we're almost out of time, but I want to let everyone out there know that our next episode of Live, Work, Thrive will be on March 2nd on money, sex, and happiness and how to thrive after kids. Join us by signing up at scarymommy.com/live, work, thrive. And also call our hotline. You know I love our hotline messages. Call us. Give us your suggestions and questions at 1-800-422-3910. So I want to thank our incredible panelists. I feel like we could have kept talking for a whole other hour because I just love this conversation, and you both have such keen insights. So Dr. Dolly Chug, award-winning sociologist, social psychologist, and professor at New York University School of Business. Sign up for her free newsletter called Dear Good People. It offers monthly tips on how to be the inclusive person you mean to be. Did I mention it's free? It's a free newsletter. Sign up. Nothing's free. Nothing good is free anymore. So go get that one. Also, her next book is A More Just Future, Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change, will be released in fall of this year. So look out for Dolly's book. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dolly.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
And Cheyenne, thank you as well. Cheyenne is founder of CEO of Firefly Worldwide, Inc., a global education consulting practice, and you can learn more about her research and services at letsfirefly.com. So nice to meet you tonight, Cheyenne.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invite and the conversation. And Dolly, great meeting you too.
Wonderful to meet you, Cheyenne.
And also, we thank Rosetta Lee for joining us, diversity speaker, educator, and outreach specialist at the Seattle Girls School. And I know that there are a number of resources out there that you both have mentioned a few, but we're going to connect with our guests afterwards and post some links and recommendations they might have for you all on our site. So anyone out there looking to continue, to begin, to start, to grow, you can have this as a jumping off point. So have a great night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And as we've talked about here, anti-racist work is not a one and done project. It's like flossing. Remember, we have to do it on a regular basis. And even then, once in a while, you get caught with something in your teeth. So hopefully the tools that we discussed tonight were useful. And I want to challenge everyone watching out there to share this link from tonight's show with a friend. Maybe you know somebody with a little salad in their teeth, if you know what I'm saying, or maybe they got a whole burrito stuck in there. It doesn't matter. We all have that person in our life, so we have to take an active role. All of us have a role to play in working toward equity and inclusion so that we can all live, work, and thrive. Good night, everyone.